The second in our series of Prowler 5 workshops, now already at Prowler 5.2. And just before we get started, thank you so much for joining us. Just a few housekeeping notes before I let Tony, doesn't really need an introduction, but introduce himself and get into the good stuff. So, a couple of notes for today. A recording of this workshop webinar will be made available afterwards, after the fact. It will be both emailed to you if you signed up for this webinar and a reminder of the webinar. And it will also be available to stream on our Prowler YouTube channel. So look out for that along with the previous workshop on the web UI front end that was included with Prowler V5, which was last week's webinar. So both of those will be available to watch again on our YouTube channel. The second thing is we would love discussion, Q&A. There is an open Q&A and an open chat field. So if you do want to send a message, send a question at any point, we'll make sure we get around to answering all of those. And so without further ado, let's get started. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt. Thank you, everybody, for joining today's session. I just shared our link to our community Slack, so feel free to join our Slack and also enjoy it and have conversations, open conversations, of course, with our engineers, like Adrian, that is one of our API and backend engineers. Yeah, I'm Tony de la Fuente, the founder and CEO of Prowler. Very happy to keep growing the community, to keep growing also the product. During today's session, we are going to explain the basics or the foundations of Prowler, but also additionally, we are going to dip into the API and how to take the best and take advantage of the Prowler API for you to do the automations, integrations, and many other very helpful tasks that you can do with Prowler API. So we're going to see the introduction, Prowler components, how to set up your dev environment. This is key on all the series of webinars and working with the API, integrations, customizations, and how to contribute back to Prowler if you want to. What is Prowler? I mean, you know probably what is Prowler because you are here in this session, right? But let me give you a quick intro. So Prowler is an open source platform, a tool also from the CLI to a whole application and as a service where you can use for two main top use cases, right? Security operations and compliance for continuous cloud security monitoring, for threat detection, for hardening and remediation, because Prowler tells you what to do when we find something wrong, and also it helps you with remediation and automation when you need to remediate stuff either on runtime or in the code side, and of course for incident response. If you have a security incident in the cloud, you can run Prowler to take a snapshot and figure out what has happened. Prowler will help you on that. Also for compliance, you can use Prowler when you don't know what to do with your cloud security or you need state of your cloud security posture. Run Prowler, get an audit, get a security assessment, and get a point-in-time assessment to start working on your security in the cloud. The same way you can do a compliance reporting for not only for the basics of CIS, etc., but also for HIPAA, CIS, and many other. PCI and many others. You can enjoy some checks and tests that we have for pen testing, like looking for secrets, looking for exposed resources. This is some sort of white box pen testing, but it's very helpful with Prowler. We have dozens of checks for that. And last but not least, you can do data analysis and visualizations of all the data set, all the findings that we get from the cloud infrastructure, from AWS, GCP, Azure, or even Kubernetes into a same dashboard and same type and format of reportings. here is another way to see this. So you can run Prowler from pretty much anywhere, including our cloud, cloud.prowler.com, and with the proper credentials, read-only credentials, because Prowler scans in runtime in the cloud. You can go through the most common providers. We are adding new providers as well. If you have a Shodan API key, you can also enrich findings with Shodan findings to know if you have more resources exposed into the internet. And once you have everything scanned, we offer a different format of outputs like CSV, JSON, HTML, a local dashboard, also a remote or an application dashboard, because if you use Prowler v5 with the database, the application itself, everything is stored in a database, okay? Why we do Prowler? Because we truly believe in open source and how important is open source to keep growing the cloud adoption. That is what we call the open cloud security movement. We truly believe that the cloud needs something like Prowler to keep growing, and everybody in that moves up to the cloud needs guarantees of security there, and that is possible thanks to open source, right? So our impact into the community is remarkable. So we have more than 10 million downloads, more than 11,000 stars on GitHub, growing 10% every month, and growing the contributors. And for example, even AWS uses Prowler, as you can see in the AWS prescriptive guidance. Why Prowler is different to other? First, open source license like Apache's license v2. Second, because we use open standards. So no matter whatever you scan, whatever cloud platform you scan, you are going to get the same formats, the same open standards like JSON, OCSF, CSV, HTML. And also we have an open web UI, CLI, and API. And this is what you are going to see. And everything that you see open source is also in our hosted service, Prowler Cloud. Prowler is optimized for continuous monitoring, of course, as many other CSPs, but also for one point in time audits and assessments. So that is what we call also the Cloud Security SDK, because it's not only pulling, sending everything to a database, but we pull information directly from the cloud provider SDK APIs, and you can get that information straight away, right? And of course, the key part of Prowler is something that we always wanted to build is a security tool that is very easy to use. And scan your entire environment with one shot without having to get crazy in configurations, enabling, disabling services, etc. It's multi-region by default, it's multi-subscription by default, it's multi-project by default, and multi-cluster by default. Either if you use AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, or Kubernetes. So with that said, what are the most important components in Prowler that you have to take into account from version 5? Version 5 has what everybody loves of Prowler, which is the CLI, of course. You can install it, just type in pip install Prowler, or with pipx, or with Brew. I mean, go to docs.prowler.com and you can see multiple ways of installing Prowler, the CLI. But if you want the whole application, you can install it using Docker Compose. And what is that application having inside? The SDK, the whole backend with the API, the Django REST framework, built with the Django REST framework that we are going to see today, the UI that we had last week in the previous week workshop. Everything is on top of Postgres, and with Celery workers for the asynchronous execution of the scans, because in the application does scans by itself every week, every day, or manually scanning. Also an in-memory database for the message broker called Valky. Okay, good. So remember, if you want to contribute, it's very straightforward. Fork the repo, set up your local environment, make your changes, submit a pull request, and done. So we approve, we review, we approve, and the release is, as you can see, we do releases every week. So if you want to contribute, happy to take your code and help others with your code. What do you need to know when it comes to using Prowler or as a developer or contributor? Just to have a GitHub account, Docker Desktop installed in your workstation, an IDE like VS Code, Cursor, or you name it, and Postman. For this particular workshop, Postman is key because we will see later, Matt is going to use it to show you how the Prowler API works. To set up the environment, this is very straightforward. For the repo, and go to the Prowler directory. You can run the application with Docker Compose, the whole Prowler application. And for this particular webinar, it's very easy to go to the API or the Prowler. If you don't want to run anything, you can also go to the public API in Prowler Cloud. It's api.prowler.com/API/v1 or v1/docs if you want to see everything that we are going to show today, for example. Okay, so and then you are ready to enjoy. Take note of this because I'm going to jump into the next slide in 3 seconds. Okay, Matt, do you want to keep going from here? Yep, you're on mute.
Hey, it wouldn't be a webinar if one of us wasn't on mute. It's my turn today. Thank you so much, Tony. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, perfect, loud and clear.
Wonderful. Fantastic. Yeah, so let's take a look at the API. Let's just dive in. So if I share my screen real quick.
Yep, let me stop sharing. Basically, before I stop, we're going to review the whole API, how to do the basics on the API, right? Like getting token, etc., and a few examples. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, for sure. Amazing. So first of all, maybe a little more housekeeping while someone tells me whether they can see my screen or not. Those of you that would have registered you would have noticed that it was meant to be two Prowler engineers, Victor and Adrian today. Sadly, Victor is not feeling so good. He's a bit poorly, so we wish him well. And you're stuck with me for this demo segment as well. We have Adrian here to answer kind of technical questions deep into the code, if you have any that are kind of beyond my knowledge, and also just to highlight that this is a very engineering-led, very open source company and product. We are engineers first and talk and demo and do everything second. So please do come to us with interesting questions, use cases. Please do join the Slack channel that we'll put in the chat as Tony already has. Again, if you have any questions, you want to get involved in the community, we also have a publicly available roadmap, roadmap.prowler.com, which you can check out and vote for features as well. So yeah, with that said, let's jump in. So those of you that have already been playing with Prowler version 5, either hosting it yourself or by signing up for the free demo at cloud.prowler.com, you'll probably be familiar with the Prowler v5 UI. And obviously, this is all powered by an API. And it's that API that we can use directly for, more custom workflows, more specific automation that you may find useful for your use case. So we're going to cover the API basics, and then we're going to cover a couple of more interesting use cases, maybe to get your creative ideas flowing on what you could use our APIs for. So first of all, if you want to dive straight into the APIs, you can do that from the UI. Instead of going and trying to find the docs, we have our documentation here for Prowler itself, but then we also have an API reference. And if we go to that API reference, you will come straight into what is effectively Open API spec rendered documentation. So you can see here we have things you might expect for a cloud, um, a cloud web interface to something. We can see different users, tenants. We can send and accept invitations. We've got providers, which is how we add a cloud provider, such as an AWS account, to our environment. We can see the scans that have happened and trigger a scan manually if we wanted to. We can see resources and findings and how they relate to providers. All of the things you would kind of expect with an API, as well as some specific ones for the cloud hosted version at cloud.prowler.com, such as forgot password and user verification via email and things like that. So obviously with version 5.2 now, RBAC is fully supported inside Prowler. So you'll also see things for RBAC roles and what those roles can do. So there's two ways we could play with this, right? The API documentation does kind of provide a basic interface to actually give these a try and make calls to our. Can you guys still hear me? Okay, wonderful. Make calls to the API, but I much prefer using a tool called Postman, which I'll bring down here and introduce. And because you can already see I've got it open here, and because the API spec on the web page is in OpenAI, OpenAPI format, we can literally just download the API spec. So if we go back to the start of our API docs, you'll see a download button, and that will download these in the OpenAPI specification, which we can just import straight into Postman, which is what I've done here. So what we have here, I've renamed it because I've got a few different versions of the download that I play with. But what we have here is the Prowler API that's imported. So we can see pretty much everything we saw in the documentation is here in kind of clickable form. And the first thing you're going to need to do, just like you would if you were on any other website where you needed API access, you're not logging into the API by sending your username and password clear text. What you probably have is a shorter lived token, like an API token, that you then use for future requests. So we have an endpoint to obtain a token. And that just requires your credentials. So for example, devrel@prowler.com is my account in the Prowler instance that I was showing you here. It's our demo instance, and I'm using this because it's already got some good AWS and GCP and Azure environments configured. As you can see, we got lots of things to look at. We've got, way more interesting than a blank account, which I'll show a little bit later. You can see we can filter by compliance and all kinds of good stuff. So let's get ourselves some credentials for that, shall we? So I've saved my password into there's the ability to have different variable sets, just like you would in kind of GitHub Actions as environment variables or things like that. But I can hide my password in the vault here so that hopefully we don't leak any session tokens and things like that. We are going to see a bit of a session token in a minute, but I've rehearsed this and I'm hoping I can do it without it being visible. So anyway, all we need to do is we hit that request, and what we should get back is an access and a refresh token. So I should be able to, yeah, very quickly boop, get that. You're not seeing the middle of it. And I'm going to save that into another vault so that that can then go away. And we now have our token for this demo saved. So at this point, what can we do? Well, everything within RBAC now opens up to us. I'm going to unplug this microphone because it keeps failing in and out. If you can still hear me on my backup, is that working?
Yeah, it works. It works well. So
Perfect.
the quality is different, but it works.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So let's have a look. Let's first of all, who are we? Let's have a look. We can actually go. Let's get a list of tenants, and obviously, I only have access to my tenant in my environment. So this should only give us one tenant back. You'll see that because this is API documentation that we've imported, it's really good because not only does it explain the base URL for listing the tenants, it also shows you all the query parameters and the options that you could use to filter down and not have to request everything from the API for very busy environments. So page sizes, page numbers, things like that, which is cool. So anyway, I'm just going to turn all those off for now and hit send. And with our API key, you can see that in authorization, it's using the bearer token. The bearer token is coming from my vault. And yep, that's a get. And what we can see down here is, yep, there's my tenant. And there are two memberships to that tenant. And if I actually look what those memberships are, let's have a look. List all users, again, turn off my... Within the API, those two membership IDs are basically attaching our two users to our account. So what we have here is the DevRel demo, DevRel at Prowler, and then probably myself. Yeah, and that's attaching those two to our tenant. All good, all common API stuff. Right, let's see if we can have a look at a scan. Let's list all scans that have happened in our environment by the API. And again, you can see how easy using the API documentation in Postman is. I'm just clicking at the top to turn off all the query parameters. If you don't and you leave some, it will just error out at you. Yep, enter a valid date. Good error checking. Bad request. Because I haven't given it a date, I've just left it with a blank kind of date field. So we'll turn all that off and we'll just request. And if you get a lot of information, it's probably going to give you pages. So you're not going to get everything in one request. You'd have to request page 2, page 3, etc., etc. But for seeing the API, this is more than enough for us. So here we can see the scheduled daily scan. This one failed. And this one completed. You can see the resource count, the progress, how long it took, all the information that you will see us use to generate things like the scan jobs page. You see 2 failed at the top. Then we see this one succeeded, completed, resources 44, and all this information just coming from those APIs. So let's try triggering a scan, shall we? What do we need to trigger a scan? So this is an example of where we're changing something rather than so far we've just requested data. For this, instead of seeing search parameters or query parameters, if we go into the body, we'll see a parameterized template for us to fill in so that we know what we need to do. So we need to call the scan something, and then we need to tell it what provider we want to run this scan on. So let's try this. Let's do Matt's API scan. And then we need a UUID of a provider. Well, we can do that because we have providers. So let's go list all our providers. Again, turn our query filters off. Okay. Let's find, I know that I've messed the Kate's demo one up, so we're not going to try that because that's broken. My fault. Okay, the GCP demo, perfect. So that is our ID. For those familiar with APIs, pretty much everything's UUID based, which makes it really, really hard to kind of do this manually. But there were security implications for having just counting from 0, 1, 2, 3 for entity IDs because people could guess them in API requests, which is generally why all APIs look like this now.
Yep. Something to clarify, when in Prowler we call providers when we talk about AWS accounts, GCP projects, or Azure subscriptions, or even Kubernetes namespaces, right?
Sure.
I don't think I miss anything. Yeah, so far is that. Yep.
Yep. Yeah. So what we're basically saying here is, hey, what we're calling a provider is a cloud provider. I think that's probably where we coined that term from. So we already have this cloud provider configured within Prowler. I'm calling it by its ID rather than by its name. Obviously, in the UI, you'd probably see if I went into a provider, we'd be doing that translation for you when we say like, hey, like schedule a scan. Um, you know, launch a scan here. We'd be doing that. We'd be doing that for you. Whereas in the API, you have to specify the account by ID. So let's give this a try. Let's create a manual scan item, Matt's API scan against this this Google account. Let's hit that. Look at that, 202 accepted. So inserted at, we're performing a scan. We have the scan ID, which we should actually be able to use to then keep tabs on how well that scan's doing. So scans ID, we can actually, again, query params. I can put that ID in here and I can get query updates. There we go. So the scan is named Matt's API scan. It's a manual triggered scan. It's currently still in progress, but it's not finished yet. So there we go, and we can go and look at that.
Yeah, it may take some time. It depends on when you run, where you run Prowler, but it takes sometimes to show the progress, basically, because yeah, basically what it is doing underneath, right, is running and scan in or yeah, spinning up the resources needed to run that scan.
Right. So to keep everyone's data separate, the Prowler has V5 has a kind of architecture where the API is responsible for actually going and spinning up a separate containerized instance of the scanner, and then having that scanner go and connect to those cloud resources and work on that. So it's not kind of a single instance scanner handling everyone's data. So yeah, that's what takes a bit of time, right? The scheduling and then the connecting to the cloud environment. But you can see that everything we did in the API is here, right? So we're waiting for this to be scheduled. We can see that it was a manually scheduled scan. It's called Matt's API scan, and it's very different to the daily scheduled scans that have automatically been running. So let's refresh that, see how we're doing. Okay, we see it failed, but that's fine because the previous scheduled one failed as well. I tell you what, let's take a definitely configured environment. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and go from a name. So this one is called AWS demo, right? So let's take AWS demo, and we should be able to use one of the filters in our tenant, in our providers. Let's have a look. Let's see if we can use a filter for
the second one.
alias. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's hit that in there. Let's send that. Have I messed it up? Yeah, it does not need quotes. And there we go. We only get one response back. One, pages one, count one, and that is the UUID I need to trigger a scan on that provider. So trigger a manual scan. Let's do this again. That's API scan 2. Let's do it on a provider we know is configured. Obviously, some in our demo account are configured, some are unconfigured to show all the different states. So we know that this provider is configured and running. So let's hit that. And we got an accepted, and we can see that it's scheduled that task. And then let's head back in here, and we should see Matt's API scan 2. And we'll come back to this, but that scan will go ahead and do its happy things, and then we'll show the API viewing those results as well. There's a very cool part of the API which is a bit like the fire hose. If you want to do all kinds of like custom data science or custom like interpretations of the data that you can get from Prowler, there's actually a resources endpoint which I've been playing with a little bit, And effectively, if you turn all the filters off, and yes, it really does need paging. But if you kind of annoy the API by saying that, you know, for a given page you want a lot of data, I won't, because it'll put load on things. But this will basically give you all the resources in your environment kind of by resource ID, but then also embed under that resource all the current findings for that. So like here is a single resource. So this is an AKS agent pool. We can see it's in the ECUS, so this definitely isn't AWS, is it? Because there's no dashes in the regions. And we can see this is its provider. We can see the findings attached to it. And obviously this will allow you to then go and find those findings and find the metadata from those findings by calling those findings API endpoints. And this is a really nice way you could easily build kind of a graph or a visualization of all the providers and all the findings hung off the individual resources, which I think is very cool. Another thing you can do with API, so moving on to, we'll come back to look at the scan results because scans aren't immediate. You know, API responses back from thousands of cloud endpoints are not immediate. But another cool thing about it being open source, having this open API, is if you don't like, I mean, and why wouldn't you? It's beautiful. But if you don't like, even with Prowler Cloud, even if you're a paying customer or an open source self-hosted customer, if you need something specific for a certain team which you're not seeing visualized here, like you want to run your extra computations on your data, then you can do, because you have access to all the data that the UI is using. So for example, and it's thanks to Tony actually for finding an article on this, I spend quite a lot of time writing Prometheus pollers, just like Python scripts to go and pull API data from JSON just to then visualize it time series into Grafana. Turns out there is just a JSON API interface, which I wasn't aware of. It's actually changed name now. It's actually now called the Infinity Data Source, but it was the JSON API data source. And what this basically allows you to do is configure Grafana to directly pull data from JSON API endpoints. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to once again refresh our token and just demonstrate this to you. Obtain a token. And once, I mean, if you wanted to like play back the recording, I'm sure you probably would be able to piece together all of this token, but by then it would have expired. So, okay, cool. So let's add this token into Grafana. Let's save and test that. There we go. We've got a successful health check. And what this allows us to do then is start actually building custom dashboards and custom data feeds that we might care about. So what I have here is I'm hitting that resources endpoint that we were just talking about. And I'm pulling out of the JSON we get back from resources, and I used the resources information here to kind of understand the format of the output and what fields I needed and things like that. And what we can end up building is basically, for my example, findings per region. So we just care about the type, updated region, the findings count, which if we have a look here, we can see we'll have these entries quite a lot, but the findings counts are all there. And then what we can do is we filter because we only want resources of type resources. We don't want any other metadata from that API endpoint. And then in transform, we say, let's group by region and then count the calculated fields. If I disable that, you can see that the raw data coming from the API looks like this. We have all the different resources. We have lots of different, within the same region, we have different findings on different resources, but it's super easy with an API to pull that data, collate it, you know, add these kind of transformations, which, you know, Grafana is really good at, and end up with exactly the data in exactly the format you want.
Yeah, there is something very cool of this, which is that regardless the cloud providers that you are scanning, or even any cloud providers, you use the same API methods, the same calls, the same syntax for everything. So whatever you use, even if you are in the world of Microsoft Azure, Google, or even Kubernetes, you are going to get this type of output with which is great out of the box, because that is part of the key of Prowler, to give you the same stuff regardless the cloud provider.
That's a great point. Like even here on this graph, we have some Azure regions, we have some AWS regions, and the only way I can tell that is because we know our cloud providers and we know that they name them slightly differently with different formatting. But if I wanted to, I could very easily expose the actual provider type and then subgroup by provider, right? So I could have different colors, or I could have different bars for each different cloud provider. The choice with what you wanted to do is yours, because you have all the. It's not a black box. It's, you know, you can get to all the data we're providing in the API, and that's super important. But it's not just a read API; it's a write API as well. So things that you absolutely cannot do with competing closed source providers. For example, I want to spin up 1,000 AWS environments through AWS organizations. I want them automatically added to Prowler. We can do that. That's not an issue, because you have the ability to go and look at those APIs. So let's quickly go back to Postman and have a look at what we're talking about there. So we can see here, I have providers. And just like we can add providers in the UI, just like we can list providers in the API, we can create a new provider. And in the body, it will tell us what we need. What we will need is a very minimum, the UID. So the UI actually explains this better. That is, for example, the AWS account ID, an alias, a friendly name to give it within Prowler, and which provider type it is. And then by sending that, we can create a provider inside. So there's a little bit more configuration than that, because we also need for example, to do assumed roles within AWS, you need to know what the external ID is. So there's a little bit more to, like, this is going to be a more advanced use case of the API, but it's something that we are very aware that customers are interested in. We've already got a couple of customers writing blog posts on how they automate using the Prowler APIs to kind of automate addition of AWS accounts. And so I was having a play with this just before this webinar. So I was envisaging something like this, right? So you'd effectively, and we can, like, if we had time, we can go and dump this in GitHub Actions and see if it runs first time or not. But the idea would be something similar to this. What you would have is you would have your master credentials saved somewhere like Vault, and this is in GitHub Actions format. You would then create an AWS account using AWS organizations. You'd pull that account JSON so that you have the new account ID. You could then go and register the account ID as a new provider against our Prowler environment. We could give the alias for the provider the commit ID. So, you know, we end up with a provider that's only there in a CI/CD case scenario, with the ID of what we're running, because we're going to delete that AWS account. We're going to delete that provider afterwards, after we've got the data, after it's either failed or passed a production snapshot as an account. And, you know, we give it a role name. We then can go into the AWS account, because obviously we've got organization creds. We can go and create the IAM role, the read-only role that is needed for Prowler to run all of its scans. There's a couple of things that would be needed here. First of all, we need a read-only role. Now, this is a very lazy way of doing it. The correct way of doing it for Prowler is in our GitHub, we always maintain a set of required roles and required permissions that you will need, and even some CloudFormation to enable it for you. So you can see here, it's basically read-only view permissions, but there are some things with view privileges above the view-only access, for example. So it's better to refer to the Prowler list of roles. It won't make a Prowler scan fail. It will just mean that you might not have the ability to run certain checks against certain services within your cloud provider, because the Prowler probes will just get a, you don't have authorization to do that and things like that. Any comments on that, Tony or Adrian?
This is amazing integration. It's a very, very powerful way to demonstrate that you can even create more secure environments using the automation of Prowler through the API. Yes, great.
Yeah, for sure. And then the only thing that it's funny, right? Doing these kind of webinars and everything being open, like I've realized there's a documentation kind of failure in the fact that one thing we do mandate is, and I'll just show you this, and it's a best practice with AWS for assuming roles cross account. We do mandate that you send us a external ID when you are, so that your assumed role is configured as an external ID. And I'll show you what that looks like now.
Yeah, this is important when you run Prowler in AWS, inside AWS in an account, either in an EC2 instance or in a container with ECS or whatever. That container or that instance has a role, so you can take advantage of Prowler also to assume that, using that role, assume another role in third-party accounts or your own accounts in other places, and do the magic, all the magic, as you can see here in the demo. So we provide also CloudFormation templates and everything. So it's very straightforward. This is valid only if you are using Prowler inside AWS, but if you are not, you can provide temporary credentials.
Yeah.
Or static credentials, which is not a good practice, but still.
You can provide static credentials, but we'd rather you did this. So yes. what you see is this external ID, and this is required to be set as an external ID in the policy, in the role that Prowler will assume to access those endpoints in your account to do the scans. So this basically prevents confused deputy attacks. This prevents, anyone other than Prowler effectively assuming that role. And the one thing I noticed is, where do you find this for your account? Because you need to know this before you create the account in Prowler via the API, right? And so this is actually the tenant ID for your account. So what you can do effectively, if we look at this 532DE, and again, we'll update the documentation, and we're actually going to release some helper scripts to make it easier to do automatic adding of accounts via AWS organizations and things like that, because this is a really great use case, for Prowler and for the API is like, hey, like it'll just automatically add our new accounts and we can create a full CI/CD pipeline. So watch out for that webinar coming soon. But yeah, if we look here, if we look at 532DE, and then we go back into our tenant.
Yeah, this is Matt. While you are finding that, so let me clarify something. This is a game changer when it comes to assessing AWS accounts or any cloud account or infrastructure with Prowler, because before having an API and the server, you had to download Prowler, run Prowler, get the results and everything using a script. Now you don't need to launch the whole platform because it is running already. So you only have to talk to Prowler, the API, right?
For sure. And yeah, like this is gonna feature in a deeper dive into CI use cases for Prowler upcoming, and we're gonna have this in an actual environment where we are dynamically on the fly spinning up and shutting down AWS accounts just to run a proof of safety, proof of test for our application deployment, and then we might promote that to production and move our DNS or move our load balancers cross account to it, or we might not, depending on what Prowler says about the safety of that account. We can then, from that point, have Prowler continue running, check drift, check what has changed in that environment over time, and all that good stuff. But yeah, as you can see, like and let's go back and check those scan results actually before we do any Q&A. Tony, is there any questions that need answering that you've seen? Any comments, Adrian, that you'd like to make while we go back and look at that manual scan?
No comments. All clear.
All good. So here we go. There's Matt's API scan 2, manual scan, 278 resources, and we can either see findings in here, which is a really nice way of doing it because you can filter down on everything, even filter down on changed from the last scan of this given provider, which is super cool. But also from the API, there's a few ways of doing this, right? So we can either list all scans, and we'll see that my scan, Matt's API scan, is the latest and has a new ID. And then I can do receive data from a specific scan, and I can put that in here. Okay, and then I get the full, this is the provider, this was the task. Okay, and once I have that, I can then go findings, and I should be able to receive findings from a given scan. Give me a second. Yeah, so we can filter by scan. I'm going to do that. I think it's the second time in this webinar I've done the I've used any of the filters, but I guess I'm just being lazy. Where was I? And this is super useful. Again, like little things that I've worked with so many products that are black boxes, and even in our UI, right, we show you, yes, this has changed from the last scan. But if you want to go, no, I really want to know a point in time, like our UI is actually very new and very flexible, and you can drill down to no, just show me the results from this scan. But if you want to absolutely know that the results you're seeing are from a specific time and a specific scan when the environment was in a specific state, it's so useful to be able to have the API like this to just go and filter by these details. Where was I? I've lost it now.
Yeah, look in the right filter. I don't even get that now. But I think it is very, very easy to understand.
There we go.
The power of using
For
the
sure.
API, of course.
And there we go. We have found just that scan, and then we end up with a beautiful array of findings with more information than you could shake a stick at. All the related URLs, which compliance frameworks the checks are involved in. Someone that's better than me at Grafana, I'm sure would have a field day with this. But yeah, that was just a quick overview. Hopefully there was enough there to really kind of show you the potential of these APIs, from just using it to graph data, query data, understand these environments yourself. If you're running your own instance of Prowler, you can also do user and tenant management. If you're running the cloud version of Prowler, you can do user and RBAC management. Obviously, you can do both on both, but I'm saying you probably wouldn't have multiple tenants on cloud.prowler.com, whereas you might have multiple tenants on your own hosted instance. So all the APIs are consistent. I could, if I'd had time, I could very quickly change our saved base URL here, https://api.prowler.com, to a local API instance, and it would work in exactly the same way. And one last thing, and I will mention it on the recording as well in the notes before we close. Make sure if you're hitting api.prowler.com, you are hitting HTTPS, not HTTP, ignoring the fact that you shouldn't be hitting HTTP because it's insecure. If you do try HTTP, it will fail because our API endpoints are inbound HTTP proxies and gateways. They're just not going to let it through. But you do get this very strange error message, and it translates it to a GET request rather than a POST request. So you'll get something about 401, or you'll get something about a GET not being a POST. Just make sure that's HTTPS, and you will all be good. And with that, I will hand it back to you, Tony and Adrian.
Thank you. Very good job. Yep. So that is pretty much. Let me see. What is this? No, this one. Yep. Can you see my slides?
Sure can.
Yes.
Okay. I had here something. Let me see. I cannot see the Q&A. Yep. Okay. We have a question to see if somebody from the team, so Adrian or Matt, can you respond this? What will be the best practice in using Prowler to assess the current accounts across AWS organizations and have a consolidated report across at once? Do you have any mechanism of notification about critical findings? For example, critical findings. Let me respond a little bit, at least the last part.
Sure.
If you want to know what are we working on, for example, the notifications feature, you can go to roadmap.prowler.com and you will see. So we will do SNS integration, Slack integration for notifications, webhooks. So we have that in the roadmap for not very far from here, roadmap, actually. And in terms of the best practice, I think what Matt did, Matt, you can go ahead, but it's basically pulling all the accounts from the organizations, right, and running. How would you do it, Matt?
Yeah, I think that's it. It's obviously we can have multiple accounts of a specific type in a single Prowler environment. So you could have 100 AWS accounts. Every time your organization creates a new one, we add it to Prowler. You then have a single place where you can filter in that dashboard. You can track, is your security posture going up and down with the filters in the dashboard I was showing you? And if you don't filter by provider, then you are seeing, if you filter by high and critical severity and don't filter by provider, you are going to see all of the critical findings in one place. Another potential option, Tony, I guess, again, like road mapping, is you could then send those just critical issues to somewhere else. If you already had, some kind of workflow set up for, other security incidents from different parts of your security pipeline. But it'd still all be centralized around, you have all your AWS accounts scanned by one place, because then you only need to roll out one assumed role. You only need to configure it from one location. You can secure one location with ORBAC, and then you then decide what to do with the data.
The plan is to implement the same way that the same type of syntax that we have the mute list, the mute list feature that is not in the UI yet, allows you to filter in or out pretty much anything in any provider, any account, region, based on tags, based on resource names, based on many different things. So with that, that is a very powerful and deep syntax. So we want to allow this exactly the same type of syntax to add or remove notifications, alerts, and all that stuff. If, for example, I only want to be alerted if a resource with the name starting with whatever, with these tags and in this region and in this account, alert me. Other than that, I don't care. I don't care for alerts, but I do care for compliance or whatever else, right? Like, I only want to have a pager if I have a expose S3 bucket in my production accounts, right? So that is coming. That is a very, very common use case that we want to solve, of course, with our users and customers, and that is coming. That is coming soon.
Yep. Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks
Thank
for the
you.
Thanks for the question, Andrew. Really appreciate that.
Yep.
And
And I think we are running out of time. Because
for sure,
at least I have to jump to another call in 2 minutes.
the curse of the founder. The curse of the founder. And
Founder
well,
mode.
the Q&A session is always open 24/365 on our
Exactly.
community Slack channel. So go to prowler.com/Slack. There's a introduce yourself section. Come and say hi. We're a pretty friendly bunch. And yeah, we'd love to hear more questions, more thoughts. There's a news section where we'll keep you up to date with the roadmap and all the great work Adrian and the rest of the engineering team are doing.
Yep. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Adrian, for the work that you guys are doing on the API and the backend of Prowler. And yeah, see you next webinar that we are going to talk about more interesting things to keep growing Prowler, to keep taking advantage of one of the most popular open source tools for cloud security. Thank you. See you soon.
Awesome. Thanks. We'll see you for the next one. Bye.
Bye.